Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun set of books. It's kind of weird now that I'm in sort of a, not necessarily post-Booker season, but you know, after having finished the long list, there's something quite nice about being like, oh, cool, here are these other books that I've been wanting to read, alongside some of my sort of Booker project, wider, my wider Booker project thing. But anyway, let's get talking a little bit about the books I've been reading this week. First up, a book that I kept on taking on holiday with me or taking away with me and then never actually reading, mostly just because I really wanted to get into the rhythm of this book. And once I did, I really loved it. And this is Hans Smith with Portraits at the Palace of Creativity and Wrecking. Try saying that while drunk. It's a really interesting and intriguing book. It takes a sort of a very odd sort of approach in some ways. It's a very experimental book in some ways, but I really enjoyed the rhythms of this. So essentially we start off with a woman who is sort of talking and sort of reflecting on parts of her family, and sort of the kind of histories of everybody around her to some degree. And this builds into something bigger and bigger as this sort of takes on more of almost mythical fairy tale style thing in places, also with this sort of brutal realism. There's a lot in here about sort of trying to discover a sense of place and sort of going to parts of Russia for bits of it and all these other things. And all of that is not really selling what this book does so well, I think, which is it builds its own sort of vocabulary of how it refers to characters, and it sort of builds this musicality and this rhythm. And so, for example, the book starts with kind of creating there's a character who is a ghost of a ghost. And as the book goes on, we sort of, at one point they become the ghost of a ghost of a ghost. It just sort of plays with all of these sorts of things. It has this real joy to it. There's a real sort of playfulness and a real just sort of yeah, I don't even know what the word is. There's a kind of a ludic quality to it. There's this sort of constant rhythm and sort of challenging nature that kind of just keeps building. And so although there is a plot to this book, it sometimes feels almost weird to talk about that plot, because I think a lot of what's really exciting about the book is all the other stuff it's doing. And for example, let's find a good example here. All of the chapters are done as portraits. So portrait 28 or portrait whatever. And they all have their own mini titles, like subtitles. And this also builds into some of the wider narrative of this. So one, there's a woman with a cave inside her. And she also is a character that we then sort of build these other sort of bits off. So yeah, a really interesting read, and I'm glad that I finally read it after what feels like a long time of kind of waiting my turn to feel like I'm really ready to be in the mood for it as well. Next up, a very different book in many ways, a book that I bought during lockdown and have also not touched since then, and I'm glad I finally picked up again. Negative Capability by Michèle Roberts. And this is a memoir, and it talks about essentially kind of recovering from bad news. And particularly in the case of this, Michèle Roberts writes a novel, submits it to her agent, and they say, hey, look, we're not really looking for this. I don't think we can do anything with it. It's not the right book. It's not the right mode. Not the right time for this almost. There are all these sorts of things that happen. And she, as someone who is a writer, that's her lifeblood. And so suddenly being told that 13 or 14 books in, I can't remember exactly how many it is, that this is not going to work, it suddenly feels like the beginning of the end, that the idea of what it means to be a writer whose writing is now not accepted after all this time is a strange thing. It's a real blow for her and her sense of identity. And so what happens then in the rest of this book is she meditates on those things. So what it means to sort of be a quote unquote failure, what it means to recover from that, what it means to do all these other things. And I found it really deeply interesting because there's a real beauty to the way she tells this story. She sort of uses it as a springboard to talk about family history and to talk about philosophy and ideas, and she talks about so many other things within this. And a big part of what she discusses within this is this idea of negative capability, an idea that was sort of about basically making peace with being uncomfortable and making peace with at times being not very good at things. And so although it sort of feels almost like a self-help book in that respect, it's also largely about writing. It's about family. She goes into her own personal story quite a lot in this book. She reflects on previous novels she's written and all these other things. And there's something so beautiful and heartfelt about the way this holds together. And particularly, I think, for the time it came out, because it sort of came out around lockdown. There's a sort of quality to it that feels like it's very much about that as well. This sort of, actually, now the world is kind of on fire. What do you do? How do you make peace with things not being okay? And I think it's just a really beautiful and really heartfelt book. Next up, keeping within a sort of a memoir, Sarah Moss with My Good Bright Wolf. And I think this is just extraordinary as a book. I think this is a really well done book. I love the novels of Sarah Moss. I think she's an incredible novelist. I think hit rate wise, for me, almost every single novel of hers I've read, I've adored. I think she has this real vibrancy with her language, this real this real pointedness, this real strength to her writing that comes from this real precision and brutality, but there's something lingering behind it. There's a menace, there's something in there. And My Good Bright Wolf is her exploring a bit of her family life, and her sort of personal life. She's written another non-fiction book before, which is talking more about when she lived in Iceland. And she touches on that a little bit here. But My Good Bright Wolf is especially about the kinds of demons that haunt her, and particularly, as we kind of come to find, a lot of things around mental health, around eating disorders, around various other things. It's a difficult read. There are parts that are incredibly challenging of this book. However, I think that it is exceptionally well done, because not only does it add a bit of insight to some of the novels she wrote, because you can either see overlapping themes, or you can see the mental state she was in when she wrote those books, but it also gives a bit more of an insight to who this novelist is behind the scenes. And I think particularly her being a writer and writing a memoir that talks about this, the ways that this often interacts with her health is so interesting, because she, for example, particularly in the opening passages of this book, really puts side by side her mental health and feelings of not being good enough, of feeling, inadequate, with the kind of almost the narrative voice of this book, where she is both writing this book and there are these intervening voices that cut into the narrative that are almost her sort of frame of mind. This critical self voice becomes part of the narrator, and so you are reading her and a voice telling her she's not good enough at the same time. And it's heartbreaking. It's a really difficult book in that respect, because of just how much heaviness is within this book. But I also think she does it so brilliantly. She writes this just incredibly, of expressing all of these thoughts that are going on, and particularly the ways that this kind of intervening character of other external thoughts manifests in her day-to-day. It's a really bold piece of writing, and I just think it's incredible. And it also just makes me really feel for her, that this must have been incredibly challenging to write, to put out there, to kind of have to engage so heavily with some of the darkest moments of her life as well. And last but not least, Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst. And so I'm a big fan of the books of his I've read. The Line of Beauty, I think, for example, is just, still think it's just such a phenomenal piece of writing. And then Our Evenings, his most recent book, is one that looks at sort of almost some of the same sort of demi-monde, I guess, of something like The Line of Beauty. I think Alan Hollinghurst is slightly preoccupied in a really interesting way with the sort of middle upper class parts of society, the kind of behind closed doors secret society groups, and how they wield power, and how the people without power are kind of left on the margins of some parts of this. And so what I think is really interesting in Our Evenings is how he brings that together. Our main character is a man called Win, who is, his father is from Myanmar, although he doesn't know his father. But as a result, he moves through the world as a man who looks Burmese, but has been brought up as part of these very elite schools, so speaks incredibly incredibly well as the kind of person, like, you know, he sort of fits in. If his face wasn't seen, he would fit in almost perfectly with these sort of upper class people. It's kind of the school that's in this book is, I think, meant to be Eton, but isn't kind of explicitly called that. And I think it gives this sense of, you know, how that sort of translates into his future life. He becomes an actor, but his school friends become, for example, a senior politician who bears a striking resemblance to Boris Johnson. He is also involved in Brexit. So there's a kind of mirroring here where the characters are operating, you know, they're not politicians who we currently know, or they're not an actor who we know, they're not real people in that sense, but the rest of the events in the book are seemingly fairly real. So you know, COVID comes into this book, Brexit comes into this book, so these other things are real. So I think they are meant to be placeholders for people like Boris Johnson. And what we then sort of see is the kind of corruption of power, partly, but also the ways that these people interact with each other is so fascinating. So this slightly sociopathic character who then goes on to be this this big politician, people are always saying, oh my gosh, you know, you must have known each other at school, and, you know, how was that? And all he can really remember is actually really being bullied by this man and realizing how sociopathic he was. And these summers where he would spend time at the house of this guy, but actually get on better with his father, who was, for, you know, less of a sociopath, essentially. And so I think this book just does some really beautiful things in how it displays those relationships, and particularly Wyn, as our main character, his sort of burgeoning sexuality, is told in a very spare style, and without spoiling anything, the end of the book kind of hints at why that is. This is sort of told almost as a memoir, so we are almost in the presence of basically an actor revisiting his life and telling it as a memoir. And as part of that, we see that often he'll allude to things and then we don't necessarily have to go into details in a way that a memoir would do, perhaps, but somebody telling a novel, you know, being a narrator in a novel wouldn't. For example, we're told very early about somebody who he meets while I've now completely forgotten the word, but where you stick out your thumb and like a car collects you along the road. My brain is not picking up that word, you know what I mean, of just sort of, you know, being picked up by a stranger to be basically driven part of the way. And there's a kind of sexual element to this where he suddenly realizes a bit later that he was basically being flirted with, and we get this fleeting moment of being told that basically they would have these summers together, or they'd have these other moments together later, and that at that moment he didn't realize what it would be. And so that's someone telling their memoir, right? That's somebody, or they're kind of dictating their memoir of going back over and saying, oh, well, I won't tell you all the details, but as things would later happen, he and I had this tempestuous affair, and then never going into detail. And there's a lot of that in this book that at first I was kind of confused about, of like, when are we going to pick this up? And again, without spoiling anything, I think the end of the book tells you why. Because there's a way that this book ends that means that kind of recontextualizes parts of this. But I just think it's a beautiful book, with sort of Alan Hollinghurst's trademark style of this very beautiful lyrical style, whilst also, you know, this very kind of consistent, almost upper middle class tone to the whole book, but also just with these moments of absolute filth in them, which is very Hollinghurst. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and I think it's just a beautiful novel. I think I've enjoyed others of his more. I think Line of Beauty still for me is a stronger novel, but Our Evenings has this real poignancy to it that I really think is beautiful. Anyway, those have been the books I've been talking about this week. I hope you're doing really, really well and having a good week, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.